Hello, and welcome to HUC Connect. My name is Kristen Young, and I am Director of HUC Connect at Hebrew Union College. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, the 2025 Roger E. Joseph Prize webinar, How to Fight Antisemitism During Divisive, Partisan, and Dangerous Times. We are thrilled to welcome members of the Joseph family in the audience today. Stacy Burdett, our guest speaker and recipient of the 2025 Roger E. Joseph Prize, and Hebrew Union College President Andrew Rehfeld, today's moderator. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available at huc.edu/HUC Connect on demand, our archive of hundreds of recorded public programs. We invite guests to submit questions in the Q&A feature, and we will answer as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Hebrew Union College President Andrew Rehfeld.
Thank you, Kristen, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. At the 2025 ordination ceremony in New York, we were honored to confer the Roger E. Joseph Prize to Stacy Burdett, a public policy strategist and advocate countering anti-Semitism, and we are just thrilled to host her at today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar just 2 days after the United States joined Israel in taking military action to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. We are under a sense of fear and concern about what comes next, and that comes as over 24 hostages are still being held in Gaza, over 600 days after they were brutally captured. Nearly 1,000 Israeli soldiers have been killed, in addition to the 1,200 civilians slaughtered on October 7th, and tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, their homes and region decimated because of Hamas's barbarism. We are experiencing a second romantic period, a time when the sleep of reason, as the artist Goya described it, is being overcome by monsters. Our hearts are breaking for the enormity of the suffering, and we recognize that it will take generations for the many peoples who for centuries have called that land their home to recover from this historic trauma still unfolding and now having opened a new theater. We pray that the hostages are released soon, that the fighting completes, and that peace swiftly descends upon the region. The Roger E. Joseph Prize was created 45 years ago by Burton Joseph and Betty Greenberg of blessed memory, to honor the memory of their brother Roger, a man of exceptional personal courage and devotion to justice. Roger E. Joseph's legacy has been sustained since 1978, when the first Joseph Prize was presented to Victor Kugler, who sheltered Anne Frank and her family at great personal risk. For the past 45 years, the Joseph Prize has been presented to outstanding individuals, organizations, or institutions whose work fulfills the highest ethical values of our tradition. The Joseph Prize recipients have been recognized for eradicating racial prejudice and religious discrimination, commemorating the victims and righteous rescuers of the Holocaust, promoting peace in the Middle East, as exemplified by the work of our last year's prize recipient, Hand in Hand, among many other worthy causes. You can find all of the extraordinary Joseph Prize recipients to date listed on the Hebrew Union College website at the rogerejosephprize.org. The URL is in the Q&A. It's been particularly poignant to present the Joseph Prize these past years as we're coming off a pandemic, as it's been reminiscent of the era when Roger E. Joseph was tragically affected by the polio epidemic of 70 years ago. His remarkable fortitude continues to remind us to be resilient and hopeful, even in the face of great societal challenges. In our audience today, we're joined by Roger's beloved family members, and we thank you, his family, for this annual opportunity to share your father and grandfather's story. I'm honored now to share a video in which Linda Karshan tells the story of her father, Roger E. Joseph.
Certainly didn't expect a pandemic to hit, but when it did, the very first thing that came to mind and into the minds of my sisters was the polio epidemic of 1951, which was so formative in our lives. I had in mind my father, who in 1951 was completely paralyzed by the polio epidemic, hospitalized in an iron lung for 2 years, and he sustained himself knowing that his brain was unaffected. Probably he would never walk again, but he determined to live. I was 4 years old when my father was stricken. The polio vaccine had not been created yet. That did not come till over 2 years later. So the country was in a state of panic, and certain friends, neighbors wouldn't give my sister and myself a ride home, for example, afraid of contagion. It was just a terrible, terrible fear. I remember exactly the night when my father fell. The doctor was called. It's my uncle, and I remember perfectly peeking through the keyhole of the bedroom when my uncle took the hammer to test his reflexes, and there weren't any. And he said, "It's polio." And I remember the ambulance, very kind of turquoise blue, and I remember that ambulance pulling away. And again, the story is, and just to relate the pandemic to the epidemic, 3 or 4 hospitals would not admit my father because it was so contagious, and they were not prepared for this. Ultimately, he went to the University of Minnesota. Crucially, for him and for my life, he had an IQ test right away. His brain was a genius, IQ was fine, and he determined to live. Although the great neurologist A. Baker said, "I have never seen anyone so compromised with polio before. He will not live more than 2-3 years," and he lived for 16 years by virtue of will and courage. Now, it's very much worth mentioning that he had fought in World War II when he was called upon then to rise to the occasion. The tank in front of his was blown to bits. He was leading an iron tank division. He became captain on the spot and received a Silver Star. It's the kind of courage and service. He was a man committed to serve his fellow man. Confined to an iron lung, he returned home after 2 years in hospital. Breathing for him was not involuntary. During sleep, he was aided by a rocking bed. He conducted his law practice from a wheelchair, upright and alert in mind, reminding himself to breathe. He chose the law, and that was, of course, great good fortune, because coming out of hospital 2 years later, completely paralyzed from the neck down, he went to his office every day in a wheelchair with a male aide. We had an aide, and he worked in that wheelchair. And to see him, with his files in front of him, he held himself proud. All he could move was an index finger, which was fitted with a pen, so he could sign his documents.
I want to thank the Joseph family for this inspiring tribute to your father and grandfather that helps us remember the important legacy of his work. And now I'd like to turn to today's webinar, and with great pleasure to introduce Stacy Burdett. Stacy has had a brilliant career working with policymakers, philanthropies, universities, and other nonprofit organizations on strategies to prevent and respond to anti-Semitism, even while ensuring a welcoming culture for Jews in all communities. She's testified in Congress about anti-Semitism at the invitation of both parties, including in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, 2023, the Hamas terror attacks. Her biography is extremely impressive, and I usually spend some time outlining it here. But in conversations beforehand, we thought it would be more effective to give her the opportunity to share a bit more of her story in detail. And I'll say something more about her biography when we get into discussion. Before she begins, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have questions that you would like addressed, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar to submit your questions. And now please join me in welcoming Stacy Burdett for today's conversation. Stacy, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this conversation. This recognition from the family of Roger Joseph is one of the most meaningful things that's happened to me in not just in my career, but in my life. And so I loved your idea about talking about how I came to do the work that I do, because I hope it's an entry point or sparks thinking for a lot of us about how we can get involved in advocacy that represents a good vision for the future of American Jewry. For me, as a grandchild of Israeli and Russian immigrants to Washington, my inherited Jewish trauma was that of Jews who lived a mile from the White House but had no access to the policy conversation during the Holocaust. So my never again was never be outside a government decision that affects the fate of Jews. And to us, citizen activism and lobbying, that's a feature of Jewish life for as long as we can remember. But for our grandparents, for my grandparents, changing FDR's mind in the 1940s was as crazy an idea as building a spaceship to fly to the moon. So I responded to a desire to serve the community through my hometown industry, politics. And I became an advocate, first in a Soviet Jewry organization, then a small Middle East think tank, and then I spent 24 years as a lobbyist at the Anti-Defamation League. When I started at ADL in the early 90s, anti-Semitism was relatively contained. We focused on sharing the lessons from our success marginalizing anti-Semitism with other communities that were targeted by hate and trying to wrap their heads around what to do. So ADL invested in hate prevention models, anti-bias education in workplaces and schools. Even in a place like Germany, the ADL's primary activity was an anti-bias program that was launched after xenophobic arson attacks on Turkish immigrants in Rostock. And in the community, there was quite a consensus around what our agenda was. We were going to uphold principles that had protected Jews to secure our own future and to extend those protections to other communities. So we worked in very broad, very diverse coalitions, fighting for church-state separation. My own office in a big coalition spent 15 years trying to make sure that an anti-gay hate crime was a federal crime. And so we were leaders in fighting for strong refugee and asylum policies, even though Jews were already covered separately under something you might have heard of called the Lautenberg Amendment. So Jews were automatically able to prove that they had what you need, a well-founded fear of persecution, but we were focused on other refugee populations. And it was a more confident time. Israel was negotiating peace with its neighbors. As a lobbyist, I was lobbying for aid to the Palestinians, aid to Jordan, aid to Egypt, and aid to Israel. And so it was kind of a golden age where it looked like human rights and democracy prevailed. The Cold War broke in our favor. And the Jewish story had come very full circle, from pogroms and exclusion to full acceptance. We even had a Jewish vice presidential candidate in Joe Lieberman. And our community was so comfortable that ADL actually publicly criticized Joe Lieberman for speaking in too exclusionary a way about his Jewish faith on the campaign trail. And so even though his candidacy was such a source of pride, at the ADL, we knew that we would have criticized a Christian evangelical candidate for speaking too much about his faith, about how Americans should reaffirm their faith in God, we decided we had to hold our own Jewish community member to the same standard. And so that is a very sweet spot to be in, where you have that kind of confidence, even to criticize someone from your own group for the sake of a principle and for consistency and integrity. And so working in coalitions, upholding more universal values, and being bipartisan, it was a mitzvah to protect Jews, and it was very strategic. It embedded our community into the social fabric, into the political conversation, and integrity and the judicious use of political power. That's a luxury that we could afford because we felt accepted. So that synergy between the right thing to do and the smart thing to do was very easy and very morally clear and very coherent. We could make Jewish community issues a political winner on both sides of the aisle, and we were in the winner's circle. And so we had, like I said, a luxury of picking battles, sometimes choosing the universal good, and other times what was good for Jewish people, what was necessary for Israel. And like all golden ages, that came to an end. Israeli-Palestinian peace became, of course, very elusive. The last time I went to an international forum to share our Happy Jewish experience with defeating anti-Semitism was a United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, where we encountered a very well-organized precursor to the BDS movement. And when anti-Semitism exploded after that conference, after 9/11, something emerged that we then called the new anti-Semitism. So containing anti-Semitism, that containment was ending. Taboos against anti-Semitism were falling away. And the firewalls and tools we thought we'd perfected were insufficient. And we, of course, were confronted with an anti-Semitism that was very cloaked in speech about Israel. And we were mostly scared for Jews in Europe then, but organizations were very eager to drive action and engagement and sound the alarm bell and activate donors and supporters. And so it became harder to pass on an idea, to pass on an initiative or a piece of legislation, even when it was a little bit too zealous, a little bit too shrill. The onslaught of anti-Semitic incidents and hate made it difficult for organizations like ADL and a lot of legacy organizations. You did not want to look weak or timid or unable to stand up for Israel or for Jews. And then we entered a situation kind of like we have today, where very zealous supporters, politicians, donors are running full speed ahead to call for action. And the consideration of how our action might impact the long-term positioning of Jews or our partners, those things are a little bit deprioritized right now. We can have opinions about that, but it came from a set of external circumstances. For so many years, ADL didn't support laws against BDS or efforts to legislate a definition against anti-Semitism, but threats against Jews escalated, and the pressure for answers became very overpowering. And so I'm sure everyone has been in a conversation like that. If you're a policy expert or a practitioner, slowly, you find yourself pressured to support measures that may not be effective, might even be unhelpful, and might divide communities, or in a lot of cases, split Democratic votes. And so we were shocked by terrible anti-Semitism that we never expected. And a lot of organizations began supporting policies that pit us against other communities, whether you think it's for the right reason or the wrong reason. But the change in that strategy and the calculus that you have to weigh in making decisions really changed the work. And what started as that increase in tension suddenly turned into a situation where one national party identified issues around Israel and anti-Semitism as a very quick and effective and useful tool to taint their political opponents. And that is irresistible for a politician or political party. And this situation where anti-Semitism in Israel became wedge issues to divide Jews from the party they classically voted for, divide communities. That started a number of years ago. And of course, I think we're seeing that situation play out today. So that divide between when you no longer have a synergy between your ideals and your strategy, it creates a lot of stress in partnerships and tension between what you need to do right now to be strong and to be the preeminent fighters against anti-Semitism and the long-term goals that started to break apart. And during the first Trump administration, it felt like a manhole cover was pulled off of a sewer. Anti-Semitism that had been literally underground, in this analogy, just started to seep out into the streets. And I felt that I wanted to leave ADL and look in a different way. I went to work at the Holocaust Museum, which is an incredible place to reflect and think and learn. Of course. And so I worked at the Holocaust Museum as the director of government and external relations. And I saw there even more how issues around the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Israel were adopted by one party as a winning weapon against their opposing party. In another point in history, it could be the opposite. It could be the Democrats using it against the Republicans, but in this moment, it became a weapon. And I set out to be able to work independently as a consultant to help institutions navigate these tensions in a way that could bring communities together to solve the problem instead of pitting them against each other. So it's been a challenge and a joy to use my experience in a way that I feel can help stitch the Jewish community together again in the fabric of an American society that is filled with good people trying to manage these issues. But because the way we frame what kind of threat anti-Semitism is, the way we understand it completely influences what we think we can do about it, what we think we ought to do about it, and the action that we take. We have some really different choices there are a lot of forks in the road about how should we reduce anti-Semitism and confront this very scary time that we find ourselves in.
Stacy, thank you for that introduction. That was compelling, interesting, and thank you for connecting it to your family. I want to get to the definition of anti-Semitism in just a minute, but I want to ask you one thing about your own personal experience because it connects with the reason that you were given this award as we have internal discussions with the family. And that has to do with what I spoke of at the ceremony in May of somebody that falls beneath the radar sometimes. And you spoke of that just a moment ago. I'm wondering if you could reflect on the work that you've done, how being under the radar has both helped and hindered your effectiveness. I mean, what are the benefits? Maybe we know the benefits of being above the radar, but and so some of the downsides of being under it. But it was important to the Joseph family, just to complete that thought, that and to HUC, that we are honoring people that don't always get the top billing in the work that's being done. And for anybody that has sat atop an organization, I can tell you that I get a lot of the blame and a lot of the credit for things that because that's my job. But What about for you? How is going under the radar? You're the one that does the work that so many of us rely on.
So it's impossible to answer this question, Andrew, without talking about gender.
Okay.
I am a strong woman, I am a determined woman, but I'm a woman. And women fill certain roles in Jewish professional life, and frequently it's sitting behind a leader who isn't, in my immediate lifetime, going to be a woman at this rate. And so there is a natural sorting in that way, but I feel very influential. I talk to reporters. I don't want to be quoted. Who am I? But I help reporters identify when reporters call me, I say, why are you writing that story? Why are you writing that story, particularly about the Jewish community at this time? I think about the impact. Do I want one more story in the newspaper saying Jews are fractured about politics in Israel? And sometimes I say, no, that doesn't achieve anything. That doesn't elucidate. That doesn't increase the protection of Jews. It doesn't move society in a good direction. So I have influence and freedom and independence. And I felt that at ADL as well. I had a lot of latitude to say, is this a good idea for the Jewish people, for the American people? So there's power, there's influence. And I worked for 22 years with Abe Foxman. And to sit next to a leader like that is the best kind of limelight there could be, even if no one sees it, but you and three people. So it really is a joy. There is influence, there is reflection, and there's connecting with people. And I don't have a public presence and an online presence, but even that's connected to gender, Andrew, because it's hard for women to be online. There's anti-Semitism online, and it sticks to women particularly. So gender is a piece of this, but I say it, she'asani kirtzono.
Stacy, thank you. And I should say, now that you're on HUC Connect, this will go viral. So you have you have to reassess those comments. Let's go to the definition that you were describing. First, before we get into some of the definitions of anti-Semitism, can you spell out for the audience what your understanding is? What are the stakes? You began to allude to that, the stakes at defining it one way or another, and as the beginning of this conversation.
So when we define things, and this is a college, right? This is rabbinic college, so when we use words to describe a problem, to frame a problem, it's very important to ask, what are we trying to get done? And the primary purpose that I think most people hold is the way we speak about anti-Semitism, the way we identify it, is first and foremost to increase the protection that Jews have against the threat. So I think the proponent of any definition, there are three, and then organizations have their own, and now universities, some of them have their own. But the goal is to increase the appropriate protection of Jews as a protected class targeted by hate. But it's very important to understand the impetus for wanting to define anti-Semitism. I talked about the Durban conference, and the world was confused. What do you mean anti-Israel hatred can be anti-Semitic? You haven't said that before. You haven't explained that before. Even at ADL, we really quite bifurcated the two. They were related. We didn't define BDS as anti-Semitic. And after 9/11, anti-Semitic incidents just exploded in Europe, and the police don't come to your house if they think it is a political incident. And the need to develop what became the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, was a dozen people working with monitors in Europe who did a survey of anti-Semitism in the European Union, and they threw the report away because too much of it was involving speech about Israel and Zionism. And when you're not tracking it and categorizing these incidents as anti-Semitic, the police don't come, you are not tracking it, and your government doesn't know there's a problem. So those are the stakes. So then there's the question of how you define it. And the IRA definition has a series of examples, and people criticize them, love them. They were an effort to say, here are some illustrations of how this is showing up. It was an authentic effort, and a lot of my progressive colleagues I know feel that it was hatched to shut down pro-Palestine advocacy. And it was not. It was a cry of the heart about a very real problem. But when we start trying to define a problem, it quickly can turn into an ideological cry of the heart. I want you to know what I mean. I want you to know what hurts me. And so none of the three definitions that we have out there work as a legal policy, just an all-purpose diagnostic tool that you drop into the criminal code. Germany dropped one of them in. I don't have faith in it.
Yeah.
So, but I think this debate over the definitions is a way to say, I want you to see that when you think you're talking about Zionism in Israel, you're causing harm. And that's a fair aspiration. I don't favor how that campaign is executed. I think it's drawing energy away from greater protection of Jews. But it's important for us to understand the intent of other Jewish people, especially now.
You know, it is interesting in the history of Zionism, there are certain standards that Zionist writers write about what a government must do to preserve a Zionist state. So the reason that I say that is that even Zionists would be critical, whether you're Jabotinsky or Herzl or Asher Ginsburg, Ahad Ha'am, you would be critical of what a government does and not be confused that that's Zionism. Somewhere along the line, obviously the government of Israel and the idea of Zionism got mixed. And how do you navigate that when, you mentioned that the ADL was not against BDS. No, I don't mean as a policy, did not label BDS as anti-Semitism. But at what point does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitic in your view, and how is that baked into the kind of definition that you think we should be endorsing?
Well, I think we need to remember that there is, I would say, 80% of the body of what's anti-Semitic, all Jews agree on. I did a webinar with Congresswoman AOC, who we just don't use her full name. And we agreed on so much. We didn't speak about things that we didn't agree on, like how we categorize Israel's operation in Gaza now. I don't call it a genocide. Other people might. But there is broad consensus. We've always focused on the differences that in the movement, in the jet stream of hostility to Zionism, there is an anti-Semitism problem. The overlap is, I believe, significant, but saying that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism doesn't serve the purpose, because you are now covering Jewish people who are very similar to historically how Jewish people have struggled with the concept of this type of nationalism or particularism. And as a practitioner, I think we need to protect a group of people, all of whom are targets of anti-Semitism. Cutting someone off from that community, from that protection, from being in Klal Yisrael is defeatist, even though we are angry. We are angry that the protest movement against a war that I wish would end contains some anti-Semitism, and that is difficult.
We're getting to another topic that I want to get to, but I just want to take a step back to bring everyone along. The question here was about can you be critical of a government and without being anti-Semitic, and what does Zionism mean? And you're introducing the idea of anti-Zionism, which has now become something that, particularly within the Jewish community, there's a lot of concern about. And I think it's fair to say that when many people say I'm an anti-Zionist, there are a lot of people within the Jewish community that feel like they're experiencing anti-Semitism. They feel they're being attacked. They feel that they are being undermined, that their core values of Jewish peoplehood and what it means to be a Jew are being assaulted. And the question is that a line too far, or why isn't that a line too far? I have my own views. I've articulated them before, but I guess for you, if Hamas is saying that they're an anti-Zionist organization, Hamas is explicitly anti-Zionist, then doesn't that make all anti-Zionists supportive of Hamas? Doesn't that, if Hamas is saying from the river to the sea, doesn't that make everyone who says from the river to the sea a Hamasnik, an anti-Semite? And we can all agree that Hamas is much worse than simply anti-Semites, just to say that. Why should that be problematic to exclude anti-Zionism from the lexicon, from the dialogue?
Well, I think we need to remember the goal is to protect Jewish people from anti-Semitism, to deepen understanding. And I want to say again what kind of eluded my last answer, which is that number one, I believe everyone should read all three definitions that are out there. The IRA
can you name them? You
definition.
mentioned three, but just name
Yes.
them to help the audience come along.
There is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition was in circulation for a number of years. Its genesis was actually in 2004, and it was adopted by an organization, a multilateral governmental organization that dealt with Holocaust remembrance in 2016. And the examples in that definition always made me uncomfortable, not because they were all inaccurate, but because they focused so much on speech and intent. And I favor the American approach, which is we look at harm and impact and the context around that conduct and how it harms a protected class, and Jews are a protected class. And so I was always a little uncomfortable with that. And I was delighted when definitions were in training manuals all over Europe in police departments. But when people started, again, out of fear and a desire to get something done, trying to make them a policy instrument, they then can be weapons. And so there is the IRA definition, and in response to real abuses of the IRA definition and real risks that it would be used against as a blunt hammer, there two new definitions were developed at a parallel at exactly the same time. One is called the Nexus document, which is a little easy to understand for the American reader. It was crafted by Americans. And it's a white paper, and it's a very, very coherent, smart document. And then there was an initiative of scholars around the world, mainly in Jerusalem, Europe, and the United States, called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And that is also a very instructive document. It drew some criticism, and I think some of it is the wording. They had a formulation. They talked about what is not necessarily anti-Semitic. And so if you say BDS is not necessarily anti-Semitic, people hear, these scholars think BDS is okay, and people criticized who the signatories were, but it's an extremely thoughtful, instructive document, and all three of them tell you a lot about where they came from, who the writers are. I'll tell you one very interesting thing that is an aside and a tangent to this conversation, but it's interesting. The Jerusalem Declaration did not identify comparing Jews in Israel to Nazis as a form of anti-Semitism. that's a gap in my mind, only because, not because of my ideology or my intellect about it, but because such a large proportion of Jews in Europe experience a form of anti-Semitism that involves that analogy, and I want to protect them. But so interesting that intellectuals in Israel, like I would feel, I wouldn't want it to be legislated that I can't compare my government to Nazis. I don't like to do it. And if you're Israeli or German or Slovakian, taking away, and you're a scholar, these were Holocaust studies departments, they were like, I thought it was I never asked them why, but I think it's interesting. They did not want to take away that expression. So there's a lot to learn in these definitions, but none of them work as stick it in the ninja definition and it'll tell you what your incident is.
The ninja definition?
No, just like the tool that you make your smoothies with, just this works. You stick it in and it tells,
It's the
context
pros and
is so
cons of
important.
every definition. The flip side, just to finish that about the anti-Semite or the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, I mean, for many of us that have children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews who are proudly anti-Zionist, and it is very unsettling. Uh, I try to encourage our students and others to look beyond the label, and particularly in a family setting, in a community setting, to actually ask the question, tell me what you mean by that, and not become reactive. Because then you can find out, oh, I mean, river to the sea. I mean, everybody living in the land should have equal rights. Oh, great. So you can have a conversation about that, about what are the challenges to that, without getting distracted by the definition. And you can also begin to build in some history about what Hamas is doing, et cetera. Because as I say to, the people in the Jewish community who object to, who want to proudly support, particularly in the Reform community, Zionism as we understand it, I ask them, well, look at the right wing, far right wing, the extremists on the right wing who use the term Zionist to mean a particular kind of Zionism that we find repugnant, excluding Palestinians from the land, forcibly moving them, even genocide. And there are people that call themselves Zionists that have that view. I proudly call myself a Zionist, but I don't feel it's right for you to label me with that right-wing view. So when we look to our family, our friends, our community, and this is getting to the question of how we navigate this for us without dividing, but as we have these conversations around the dinner table, around our homes, family, and community, to not needlessly divide, but to ask people, well, what do you mean? So, Stacy, as we are, moving into next steps here as a community, both in Israel, in the United States, hopefully the wars in Israel right now, however necessary they might be, however necessary or not you might think, or others might think there'd be. What is it that you suggest that we can do practically? I just gave an example of the very intimate space of our local communities. We're not the United Nations. Our families are not going to solve the Palestinian issue with Israel. We ought to be fostering close connections. You're out there with the community. You're out there testifying to Congress. You're out there helping organizations and museums, setting definitions. We didn't mention this, but you're on the board of the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., where a horrible murder of two I will say pro-Palestinian in the fullest sense of that term, Israeli embassy staffers were killed, were murdered at a AJC event. How do we translate the work that you've done into practical advice for people, whether in their family, their community, or nationally? And as you're answering this, I want to remind everyone on the webinar of the Q&A feature. If you do have questions for Stacy, we're able to take them in the last few minutes of the webinar. Stacy, please.
It's the right question. So there's sort of two different groups of people. I think we need ultimate just generosity and compassion for other Jewish people and for non-Jewish people, most of whom just want to understand more. People always ask me, oh my God, how do you work with DEI departments? They are groups of people, many of whom recognize that they missed a beat. And if you just explain what they need to do to be more inclusive, I've never had someone say, I don't want to do that. There are different learning curves, but so what is the task at hand? So I never blame individuals, the people in your family. I don't blame my son for thinking Zionism is a little bit unhealthy for Palestinians right now. That's a function of his notion of equality and justice. So I'm gracious with him and with anti-Zionist Jews, a lot of whom are young and a lot of whom will lead this community with integrity in their time. So I think we have to be gracious with individual Jews who are facing a lot of fear and anger. But I do think the kinds of questions you and I are asking, what is the point of defining? Where do you take people with your words and directives? I mean, I told my own story, and the implication is I don't think members of Congress should be leading leaders around by the nose to say, here's what I want to do. Are you for it or against it? We used to say, Abe Foxman or me, we would say, I like what you're trying to do. That's not an idea that's going to work against anti-Semitism. And so I want leaders to step into that sense of brave leadership and hard decision making. You might need to tell your own supporters, we are not going to go there. It will cost you enthusiasm, money, email list, quantities, viral moments. We have to hold back. We can't be led by the fear of people. We have to lead and say, this is not a choice we're going to make. We're going to choose togetherness. We're going to choose to partner with universities, not slash their budgets. That is a
You
choice
are.
that leaders.
No, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
That's a choice that leaders can make. But when we see young people who just want to end the war and are talking about it in ways that are objectionable, we need to shrink down those differences, because progressives that you don't agree with, Republican Jews that you don't agree with, they are targets of anti-Semitism. They are Jewish, and
Yeah.
they are in this family that needs protection.
Stacy, thank you for that. And I would just say, in my own experience, I found moving beyond the label when somebody says something that I react to, and it's a word or two, moving beyond the, hey, what do you mean by that? Instead of reacting to the label. Again, we're not the UN. We're not going to solve the problem. What we have to do, to your point, is navigate the difference. We have a bunch of questions I want to get to, but I do want to say this last theme that you've raised has to do with what's the trade-off between staying pure to your moral compass and feeling like you have to speak out your truth to power, speak truth to power, your voice whenever you are offended or you have something to say, versus holding it in and acting strategically. And from our own Jewish tradition, we have a great example in the book of Esther, which begins with a story that we rightly honor Vashti, the former wife of the king, who refused to dance, presumably naked, in front to please and her the king and his friends at a party. She stood up. She got expelled, but she stood up for her rights, and we praise her. We honor her. And you compare that to Esther, who did not speak up, who had to be coaxed to speak up, who had to be urged that her own fate was going to depend on her speaking up. And she didn't react. She took her time. She strategically acted. I think we need both Vashtis and Esthers. But what you're articulating is it's not always easy to tell when you should be Vashti and let your voice heard, or when you should be Esther. Let me turn to some of the questions, if I could. One, is this being recorded? Yes, it is, and we will share it with you. So Ellen Joseph writes a very practical question. I'm from the Joseph family. Ellen, it's nice for you to be here. I'm uncomfortable wearing my Star of David now. I feel bad about it and personally confused about my discomfort, fear of introducing a conflict, abandoning my support of Israel as a state, my personal distaste for the government of Israel, my support of the end of the war, and the rights of Palestinians. And I think she's expressing the kind of distraughtness that so many of us feel. Do you have a suggestion for how, at an individual level, people might navigate that sense of being pulled in so many directions?
Yeah, for our whole lives, telling someone that you're Jewish and most parts of the country where Jews live was natural, was Gordon Lieberman did not lose because Lieberman was Jewish. And I think this notion of wearing your Judaism, it's the first time in a couple of generations we've had to think about it. So I struggle with also, my Jewishness is my career, but I very rarely use the word Zionist to describe myself. And I'm not proud of that. And it's a risk to even say that here. It is a word that means so many different things to so many different people. And I don't want someone to be distracted by the information that I support Israel. And I want Israel to have a safe and secure future. So I think things like wearing your star, they are loaded. I don't think there's anything wrong with deciding that when you go on a trip to Amsterdam, you're not going to wear a t-shirt that has Hebrew on it. I think those are always choices we made. I'm sad that it's dangerous, but it puts us in the company of a lot of other people in our community who make those choices. It is sad. And I worry that sometimes we think we're the only people who are facing this. And we are not. We are together with a lot of other groups of people. And it makes me empathize more with my son's Black friends who just don't take the wheel at night because, there's too much risk.
Stacy, what comes through in your response to Ellen is empathy, that we have to all understand and make personal decisions and that there are trade-offs to be made. Rick Berkman, and Rick, nice to have you with us, asked the question, how can national Jewish defense organizations work to protect democracy while they're advocating against anti-Semitism and to support Israel? And I'll say that Stacy and I said this in the public remarks at the ordination, you've done such a wonderful job of navigating that hard passage between democratic rights and protections of any particular individuals, particularly Jews. But how do you respond to Rick at this point in time?
We're in a situation where even when an organization uses the word democracy, they're branded as lefty. So we're in a moment where everything is triggering. Andrew, you and I talked about how I say don't put litmus tests on people, but other people say, well, those are standards. So I am responsive to the fact that a plurality of Jews support democracy, prioritize democracy. I care very much about, it's not majority rules. I hate when somebody's not nice to a Jewish Republican at the Shabbos table. It happens too often and it should not happen. It's just not okay. We should not, that is a polarization and politicization that has hurt our society. And we as a group can't afford to be so very fractured. It's not safe for us. It's not healthy for us. I want those children. I want those protesters in the encampments who are Jewish. I love them. I want them. And I want to talk to them about my views and their views. So I think just bringing people together is so important. But now I lost the train of where. Yes.
That's okay. Paula Hunker thank you for being with us, Paula.
Yes.
Has a great question on exactly that. A lot of the anti-Zionist support comes from the young generation who unfortunately, in her view, I share it, who unfortunately question the legitimacy of Israel itself, not limiting it to the action of the current government, so that they collapse. Now, in my comment, they collapse their criticism of the government to the project of the Israeli state. This is also related to support of a realistic two-state solution. What guidance exists to have these intergenerational discussions, especially in families? What do you recommend as a resource for families that are trying to navigate this?
So in general, we should get out of our heads. We should stop asking our friends, do you support, what is a right to exist? I mean, we can talk about it, right? It was a very popular term in the 70s, but everyone I know has had the experience that you're alluding to, Andrew, which is that when you ask a person, why are you anti-Zionist? So often they're embarrassed that Israel is mistreating Palestinians in their mind.
Yeah.
And there's a Palestinian comedian who says it's a branding problem, and it is. And so I think we have a lot in common about what we believe. Anti-Zionists who are protesting, they're in one of the deepest relationships with Israel. They're head and shoulders above unaffiliated Jews who don't really care. And so I think we need to get out of, do you believe in, words like delegitimization, demonization, double standard? Those are cerebral concepts that don't help us understand what does a person believe about the Jewish future. And so when you talk to that young person at your table or that arch conservative, they are a group of people who are scared about the Jewish future, and they have different ideas. Some of it are tactical differences, and some of them, a lot of young people just say, I don't like the nationalism thing.
Well, I'll tell you, I used to teach a seminar at Washington University in St. Louis, so when I was a professor, on Zionism and the history of Israel. And I used to ask my students to consider this thought experiment. Imagine if the last 20 years at that point, but 25 years at this point, Israel had been run by a secular humanist lefty government, say Meretz, for example, I would call them, that was now advancing that the solution to peace is unilateral disarmament. Just imagine the government of Israel is promoting peace through unilateral disarmament, turning over its arms to the United Nations, and something, as the left thinks is radical on the right would think is radical on the left. Do you believe that that Jewish communities would have the obligation to stand up for that government and what that government was doing? And do you think that Zionism means supporting what the government is doing in unilaterally disarming Israel? That, by the way, is not too far off what some proposals are. And I would just say in such a case, it was meant to illustrate that our commitment to Zionism and the right of the Jewish people to live peacefully in their own homeland has got to be separated from our feelings about policy and government, because we can't both both of those things. You can't collapse the one into the other. Maybe finish with one question. This has been so helpful. A lot of great questions. Again, a number of people asking, will it be available on Zoom? And the answer is yes, this will be. You're probably watching it now on Zoom, although there are dozens of people with us, so thank you. Sherry Weinman asks a very pertinent question. Maybe you could answer this as a concluding one. What's the role of coalition building in combating anti-Semitism, in particular with their religious partners? And she's talking about this, I presume it's a she, forgive me if I'm misgendering, on behalf of immigrants and being rounded up by ICE. And so she's talking about in terms of what's happening right now with immigration. Is partnerships with non-Jewish communities more important or more fraught or both at this very moment? And maybe I'll give that to you as a last question. You can wrap up too and turn this over.
It's more fraught and more important. For most of my career, I didn't even bother to tell my coalition partners that Zionist is a label about me. Only in Durban, I said, hey, that thing they're screaming about, dude, it's me. You forgot. We forgot to talk about this. I wasn't scared about it. And I'm just going to take some time to tell you what that is. And when you tell someone what that is, they do understand. Some people still don't like it. There is a hostility toward Israel. We knew that this generational change was coming. But I think that synergy that I talked about between the smart thing to do and the right thing to do exists in this coalition space.
Yeah.
Now, we used to say coalitions, love them. Coalitions, hate them. It's like a marriage. But I believe that being angry at people, throwing up walls to who we will and won't sit with is dangerous for us. We are scared. We feel, what you come home from work every day and you say, I'm sick of people. I can't stand people. We cannot do that with partners because we are too small of a community. All I hear from Jewish people is, where's my allyship? I just want to be supported at work. Partnership is where you get that support. And if we abandon that, I worry that we will just be people whose children go to kindergarten across bulletproof glass. And that's not what my grandparents came here for. They want to be in the American fabric. They want to be in relationships. So choose togetherness, do the work. You will meet the good people that I work with every day who just want to understand. Maybe they disagree. Maybe they think there shouldn't be states that are ethnically majority. That's okay. That doesn't mean they want to kill me in
Stacy,
practice.
thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you, more importantly, for the work that you've done in a career that continues and continues to be more and more important, sadly, but nevertheless more and more relevant to what we need for our world today. It's been such a pleasure, and I want to thank the Joseph family again for conferring this award on someone like you who has been working, as you have said, whether in the trenches or outside of the spotlight, to raise that light and your light a little bit more. For those of you who've asked, Hebrew Union College does offer some resources, particularly with their faculty, and I want to recommend the work of Sivan Zakai, professor, doctor in the School of Education, who has written a number of things about talking to your children, about Israel right now and the conflict. Maybe we'll put some links to that along with this, Kristen, if we can. With that, I want to thank you, Stacy Burdett, for being with us. Thank the Joseph family for your support, and I'll turn this over to Kristen Young to wrap things up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, President Rehfeld and Stacy. This conversation has been very incredible, and it's always so meaningful to see how the topic and the conversation also resonates with our audience. So thank you all for joining us today as well. For the recording of today's program and more information about our upcoming webinars, please go to our website at huc.edu/HUCConnect. We invite you to join participants from all over the world to learn with Hebrew Union College through our webinars and podcasts. Please sign up and encourage your friends to join us too. All are welcome. We invite you to listen to Hebrew Union College's incredible podcast series. The College Commons podcast is hosted by Dr. Joshua Holo, Vice President of Academic Resources, and the podcast presents unique topical and scholarly conversations offering passionate perspectives from Judaism's leading thinkers. Heritage Words, part of the Jewish Language Project, is hosted by Sarah Bunin-Benor. Discover the fascinating world of Jewish languages and explore how Jewish communities creatively engage with their ancestral tongues, keeping linguistic traditions alive across generations. And Kanfei Ruach, or Wings of Spirit, is hosted by Rabbis Dahlia Marks and Dan Prath. Presented in Hebrew, the podcast takes you on a journey to discover the many shades of Jewish prayer. To learn more and to listen, please visit huc.edu/HUCConnect and subscribe to these podcasts. These programs are made possible by friends like you. Please continue to support programs like this one and help sustain our mission, preparing the next generation of Jewish leaders for communities throughout North America, Israel, and the world.